Hello again, this is Charlie Walters, and this is Coastal Matters, a monthly show co-produced by the Nantucket Coastal Conservancy with Nantucket Community Television, Channel 18. My guest today is Dave Fronzuto, who is the Emergency Management and Marine Safety Coordinator for the town and county of Nantucket. And he's here to tell us what his job is, etc. Dave, thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Some of your job is going to be obvious to some people, but it's a lot more complicated than that. So let's hear it from you.
Well, sometimes it gets quite complicated, but emergency management has always been a very high topic, important thing on Nantucket, and for many, many years it was collateral duty of the police chief or the fire chief, depending on who had maybe a little bit more spare time. But because we do live on the coast and we are an island, the town felt that it was important to have a dedicated position now. So coordination of storms, preparedness, coastal erosion, special projects. I do special projects like the jetties, the Easy Street bulkhead, reconstruction, mainly marine, obviously marine construction projects, dredging, things like that. So it's multifaceted. It certainly keeps me busy, and storm season, we're in the middle of it now for the winter storms, which tend to be more severe than the summer storms, the tropical storms. Tropical storms are usually short duration, a couple tide cycles. The winter storms, the nor'easters, normally 3 to 4 days, several tide cycles, so they're a lot more complex.
You're the first person who has held this title.
I am. Bud Glidden, from here on Nantucket, was the emergency management person for several years, and he moved away. And the fire, like I said, the fire chief has had the position, the police chief has had the position. So
I was doing some research before we started the tape, and there's I guess you'd call it a handbook called Are You Ready?, which is talking about all the things you're responsible for. And I just want to read some of the table of contents. There's one heading of natural hazards: floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, thunderstorms, lightning, winter storms, extreme cold, extreme heat, earthquakes, volcanoes, I guess that's not a problem.
that one's out.
Landslides and debris flow, tsunamis, fires, wildfires, and that doesn't even get into technological hazards. There's a lot here for you to deal with.
We do.
Potentially.
We do have a lot, and we are in a tsunami. People can laugh, but we are in a tsunami-prone zone. There have been tsunamis here in Massachusetts. There is a lot, and it's called an all-hazard mitigation plan, which is what we've developed. Ours is being reviewed right now. We just received, actually, last week, we just received a grant from the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency to update that plan. And so we literally deal with those types of things. We've had major fires, we've had coastal storms, we've had missing persons, we've had several things like that. So we kind of train for that. We do a pretty extensive training program. We try to hold at least one actual drill or tabletop exercise every year. We work with the airport on their disaster plan. They just held a drill a couple weeks ago, so we are involved in quite a bit.
Let's talk about a hurricane, because that might be probably the first thing that would come to people's mind on Nantucket if you're talking
Sure.
about emergency management. You've got to factor in how strong the wind is, what direction it's coming from, how quickly the storm is moving. There are a lot of moving pieces you have to deal with.
And thankfully, as you and I were talking earlier, weather predictions have certainly gotten easier and they're more abundant. We use a couple different web-based models that we use. We use a model called HurrEvac, which is based strictly on hurricanes. And I can factor in all of those things into the model and see what the probabilities are for Nantucket. And when we're preparing for a storm, be it a hurricane or a nor'easter, I use 4 or 5 different websites to distill all that down, and I put what we call the Nantucket factor together, because we all know that the wind blows 40 regularly around here. So the threshold that we've set for response and a more critical eye on storms is 50 miles an hour. If it's going to blow more than 50, we start paying closer attention, and we start, prepping the town departments and getting the public advised of what's going on. But we use several different products to distill that down. And I'm very, very careful. It's the little boy that cried wolf syndrome. I don't get all that information collected and disseminated unless we're pretty sure that we're going to have some issues. You don't want people to stop paying attention and because you've given them bad information. So we try to be as accurate as we can and use as much information as we can to get good information out there.
There's no such thing as a typical hurricane, but let's walk us through the sorts of things you have to do, depending on what kind of a storm it is.
Well, it depends, the difference between a summer storm and a winter storm. A summer storm, you've got a lot more population to deal with. Again, a summer storm is usually a shorter duration. You don't have the blizzard conditions and the temperature to deal with, but you do have an increased population. So, and a lot of that population are visitors and residents who only spend a short period of time here. So to get the word out to everyone during the summer event is more difficult, obviously, than it is for the winter event. The winter event, it's Nantucket folks who have been through this hundreds of times. But the summer folks, we try to make sure that they understand that there are things that we do. Ping 4 is one of the notification systems that we use, which is a free app that they can download on their phone, which is geo-referenced for Nantucket. And I can specifically target an area. For instance, if there's been a water main break in Sconset and we want them to boil the water, I can target just the folks that live in Sconset. Or if it's an island-wide issue like a storm or a major fire or some type of medical issue, we can target the entire island. We can actually target over in the Hyannis. So if people are waiting for the boat, or waiting to come over to Nantucket, they can kind of have a heads up of what's going on over here if it's something that's critical like that. We put in a siren system 2 years ago. The siren system, Nantucket people, Nantucket residents, questioned it numerous times, and like I explained numerous times, it's not for the Nantucket person. It's for the visitor. It's for the person that's sitting on Surfside Beach, who's here for 2 weeks and doesn't know to check the town's website or to check the INM. They haven't signed up for the INM Inky alerts or things like that. And those are all methods that we use. Social media, we use social media. I want the person laying on the beach to hear that siren and ask his neighbor, what the heck is that? And somebody's going to call 911 or call the dispatch center at the police station and ask the question, and then the word will get continually spread. So things like that. As far as hurricanes are concerned, we've got the typical flooding. The issue with Nantucket Harbor is the channel is oriented north and south. So for a winter storm, when the wind's pushing out of the north, the water stacks up in the harbor and really never gets an opportunity to go back out and continues to build, which is why we have flooding. Summer storm, wind predominantly is out of the southwest. You don't have as much flooding downtown with a wind out of the southwest because it's pushing the water back out of the harbor. So little things like that. And things like Nantucket has an active tide gauge that's operated by NOAA. And there are 3 in the Commonwealth, 1 in Boston, 1 in Woods Hole, and 1 here. And it's located at the Steamship Authority, and it's very accurate, and we can monitor the tide minute to minute. So if we see the tide increasing over duration, not being allowed to, the lows don't become low, they're mid-tide, and you think that they're going to build and continue to, or possibly flood areas, then we can make decisions on closing the wave barrier at Children's Beach. We can evacuate low-lying areas like Brant Point areas in the flood zone. Part of downtown is in the flood zone. So, you know, we can make those recommendations, get the word out, even if it's a matter of driving up and down the streets with a megaphone with the police cruiser to tell people that, you know, they need to evacuate, and we've done that. So that's kind of the difference. That's kind of how we would prepare for a storm.
Talking about flood zones, FEMA redid their flood maps about 3 years ago.
Yes, they did.
Talk about that.
Well, it was based on data gathered and poor information and poor data available prior to Hurricane Sandy. So after Hurricane Sandy was in September of I believe 2012, and you know, the Jersey coast and New York and those areas you know, were hit pretty hard. In the big scheme of things, Sandy is probably in the top 10 of the Nantucket storms, but it's certainly not the worst. The worst was the No Name storm in 1991. To give a reference for the tide, a normal tide in Nantucket is 3 feet. The tide during the No Name storm in 91 was 7.8 feet. So it was 4.8 feet over normal. And the second worst storm was the Juno blizzard of 2015. And that was 7.2 feet. So again, you know, four plus feet over normal. Hurricane Sandy was somewhere around the 6.3, somewhere in there. But back to the FEMA flood maps, the information and the maps were outdated, and there was a lot of damage, and the insurance companies and the federal government got together and decided that these maps in these coastal areas and these low-lying, or especially in places like Nantucket, needed to be redone. So they were redone, and it was about a year and a half process. They came here and took thousands of measurements, and for the most part, Nantucket was affected to some degree. There were about 278 additional properties that were affected in some way by the maps. Some places the maps didn't change at all. Some places they changed a few feet, and some places they changed a block or two.
I think some people who haven't seen the maps would be surprised to see how much of the downtown business area is in the flood zone.
It truly is. It's amazing, and you know, the base flood elevation for Nantucket is 9 feet, and if you have 9 feet, you have water lapping at the steps at the town building. The FEMA flood map actually, the 100-year storm literally bisects the town building. So just to give people a point of reference, that's where it is. So the maps were redrawn. We notified everybody that had been affected. We sent letters to everybody. We held 3 or 4 informational meetings where I was able to pull the maps up and reference them to the GIS, the town map, because the FEMA flood maps show a line on a page, but they're not updated as far as property lines and buildings and those sorts of things. So there's some issues right down here on Wall Street, right here close to your studio here. You know, the people built new buildings, and the flood maps, you know, didn't represent that. So I kind of reference it to the GIS map with the property owner and say, okay, it's been affected. Your property's been affected, or it hasn't. There were several people who, for instance, there were some folks out in Matticat where, you know, they got a letter based on the FEMA flood maps that their insurance had been canceled because they were now in the flood zone, and that just wasn't true. Maybe they had a corner of their property, or they had a garage or something that was now in the flood zone, but it didn't affect the house where they lived. So, you know, we were able to help people through that. So we talked to, I don't want to say we talked to all 278, but we probably talked to 200 people on their individual property. and kind of helped them through that. So they knew what they stood. Now it's probably, I probably get 2 or 3 phone calls a month, and it's normally someone who is buying a property, and they want to know, is it in a flood zone? Was it in a flood zone? One good thing that happened, if there can be a good thing after the no-name storm, was a lot of the houses in this Brant Point area specifically, people raised the houses, and they got them up out of the flood zone, and a lot of them got expanded, a lot of them got winterized, a lot of them were summer places, and they got raised up and improved, if you will. So the amount of impact on the Nantucket resident was less than it was in places like the Cape, where people really didn't do anything after those storms. They didn't really raise the houses. They really didn't do anything to flood-proof them. And now we're building structures up out of the floodplain. You see the ones along Washington Street. You see a couple, one there on Easy Street that's just been built. Several people have it in the works to get the permits to raise their houses up out of the flood zone. So it's a work in progress, but I think it's helped in the long run.
My understanding is that when FEMA redid those lines, it was because they hadn't factored in wave action. They also didn't factor in either time rising sea level.
No.
So are we likely to see more changes in the not too distant future?
Yeah, two good points. One, as far as the wave action, they've now added a category, if you will, and it's bright blue on the map, surprisingly or interestingly, for they call it a velocity zone, which is the wave action on top of that, or the surge on top of the normal tide height. So you now have the tide coming up 3 feet above normal, and then wave action on top of that, and then the sea level rise. I've read a lot of stuff on sea level rise, but it seems to be that 8 to 10 inches over 100 years seems to be what the experts are saying. To that point, as you well know, we're right in the middle of, or actually we're nearing the end of a reconstruction project at the jetties. And when the Corps of Engineers did their engineering, design, and permitting for that, they were allowed to factor in sea level rise for the jetties. So we were able to raise the jetties about 10 inches overall. So the jetty on the west side is now, the height of that jetty is going to be around 5.6 feet, and the height of the jetty on the east side is going to be about 3.8 feet. So what we want there, one of the reasons the jetties needed to be reconstructed was hazard of navigation. People driving over them and rather than coming through them. A lot of boat damage. A lot of holes in the jetty. Jetty hadn't had anything done to it since 1963. So we were able to get, again, tied to Hurricane Sandy money by Senator Kerry at the time. We were able to get, we weren't able to get, the federal government was able to transfer $10.4 million into the Corps of Engineers budget to reconstruct the jetties. So that project is supposed to be scheduled to complete on June 30th, but I met with the Corps last week. They're ahead of schedule. They're happy with the performance of the contractor, and that project is moving along.
How much of the work had to be done because the rocks were settling, and how much was because the sea level was rising?
I think it's
to quantify.
A little bit of both. I think a lot of it, the rocks had fallen off of the pile, so to speak. The rock that we're using for this project is the majority of the rock, 75% of the rock, is 3 tons or greater. So that's a pretty large rock to be putting down, and the remaining 25% of the rock is 2 tons or greater. So it's a lot of big rock, a lot more formal, if you will, placing of the rocks rather than just piling them up there. They're not allowed to chink any of the rocks, so they don't fill in the holes. They have to be load bearing. You know, they're going to be a little bit more formal structure than they were before. They're still not going to be able to be walked on because they're still going to be, you know, irregular. But I think it was a little bit of both. I think a lot of the silting in of the channel and the rocks falling off the pile. The Corps of Engineers dredged in 1985. They dredged 40,000 cubic yards out of the main channel. And this past November, we did that again. The way the Corps engineers have explained it to me is we're going to completely rebuild the jetties, we're going to dredge the channel, and then we're not coming back for 30 years. And I kind of believe them.
Let's hope they don't have to. You mentioned Mattocket a moment ago, and I want to get back to that. But first, I want to talk about your background. How did you get to Nantucket?
Well, I came to Nantucket in the Coast Guard to run the Loran Station out in Sconset. The Loran Station has since been turned off because of GPS. GPS has basically replaced Loran. But I came here in the early '80s. Met my wife here. We automated this station, and then we automated all the stations on the East Coast. And I went away and operated those stations by remote control for a couple of years, and then I came back to Nantucket, and I was fortunate enough to be the harbor master here for 22 years, and now I do the emergency management stuff. So it's been a great time here in Nantucket.
Did you grow up near the water?
I was always on the water. My father was a career military person, and I was always on the water. And I joined the Coast Guard at a very young age, and just, you know, always have gravitated towards the water. And I can't, as a matter of fact, I was stationed while I was operating the stations by remote control. That was an inland location, and I just about, it was very difficult for me to not be able to see the water, you know, and you know, play with the tide and have to deal with all that. So
Now, Mattocket, that's been in the news lately because of erosion issues, and of course it's been eroding there for centuries and centuries, but
right.
push is coming to shove in some areas out there.
Well, one of the issues with Mattocket, I mean, one of the tools that I use is Mass Coastal Zone Management has a thing called shoreline change maps, and they record back to the 1800s of the different high tide marks, and it's absolutely amazing how much land we have lost in places like Mattocket and along the South Shore, and of course on the east face also out in Sconset. But you know, we've lost hundreds of feet. There were, it's my understanding that in Sconset there was an entire neighborhood seaward of Codfish Park Road, and
Yeah, there was a whole line of houses between what's now the road and the shoreline.
so, you know, Mattocket is just as susceptible to that. The issues, you know, came to bear a couple of years ago, and the Board of Selectmen commissioned a group called the Coastal Management Plan Work Group, and we looked at all the town properties, and we ranked them in order of the 22 most critical areas to be monitored and to have some type of remediation done to them. And Easy Street was number one. 2, 3, and 4 were the ends of Mattocket Road, the end of Hummock Pond Road, and the end of Quays Road. So we were able to write a grant and get some money to do remediation, and also we wrote a grant and a contract, state contract, to rebuild the bulkhead at Easy Street. So we've addressed those. So in the coastal management plan, the order of things that needed to happen at the end of Mattocket Road, because you know it's got an entire neighborhood behind it, and also it's the access to Smith Point for a whole nother neighborhood across Millie's Bridge. So there were things that were happening there that you know, we had to address like the end of the road, the blacktop, the water was sheeting across the blacktop and just running over the bank and eroding the bank as fast as it could. So we broke the blacktop out for the most part, and we filled that large trench that was there with compatible sand, and we put in some sacrificial sand berms and some fencing, and we've planted it, and we'll monitor it. And the most important thing about any of these projects is the permits that we were able to obtain, the beach nourishment that we're now allowed to do, we can do in perpetuity, so we don't have to go back. So if there is a coastal storm and the bank does erode and we can go in there and put the sand back and not have to ask permission or whatever, and we can do that. And we can also do things in preparation for storms. Many communities build big sand berms up to protect parking lots and ends of roads, and then when the storm comes and the sand gets washed away, that's fine. It's done its job. You go back in there, you re-nourish it, and you wait for the next storm. But so we've got those permits in perpetuity.
Where do they come from? Who gives the permits?
The permits, it's kind of a mixed bag. You always start with the local conservation commission, and then the state Chapter 91, which is the waterways and wetlands protection chapter in the Mass General Laws. And then if the project is big enough or is abuts a navigable waterway, or there's several criteria, then you have to get permits from the Corps of Engineers. So it depends on what level of project it is. Easy Streets needed all three of those permits before we could move forward. Dredging permits requires those three levels of review. And the permits are time consuming to obtain. They're good for a 5-year period and usually be able to renew them. And they become very expensive to get because of the engineering and the environmental concerns that have to be considered before they'll issue a permit. So we now have those permits to do the erosion control at the end of those roads, and the issue along Ames Street and all of Mattocket, Chicago Street, and all the way down Main.
Ames is the one that crosses the bridge.
That's right.
Correct.
Ames is right. Those property owners need to continue to do beach nourishment and sand fencing and planting on their own to tie this whole thing together, over time. And I think that we have some other issues that we're looking at. We have an island-wide dredge plan that we're working on to get these permits in perpetuity to be able to dredge these channels, the end Hither Creek, Pulpus Harbor, Mattocket Harbor, Entrance Channel, places like that. Children's Beach has been dredged a couple times. We need to dredge by the town pier. But we want to have a comprehensive permit so we don't have to constantly be going back to get permits for each individual project. We're going to lump them all together. And the ones that can be permitted will permit, and those permits will be good for a longer period of time. And then on an individual project like Easy Street, Easy Street's a perfect example. It needs to be dredged. The history there is nobody can identify if it's ever been dredged there before, so that would be kind of a standalone permit. Once it was dredged, then it could be added into a comprehensive permit. But the importance there is that we've developed, and it was approved at town meeting, and it's been memorialized in my permits for the dredging the entrance channel into Pulpus Harbor, is that we now have an approved disposal site at the DPW that we can store sand, that we can use in the future for coastal erosion projects. Sand's expensive. Sand is a commodity on this island. It's selling anywhere from $25 to $45 a cubic yard, and we're running out of sand, even though we live on an island, but you can only take it from certain areas. So we find ourselves that when we want to do an erosion control project like the end of Mattocket Road, we're going to be buying sand. So these dredging projects will be able to stockpile sand to be used by the town. The first course of events at any dredging project is beach nourishment to an area closely located to the dredge site. And the reason that's important is because that's probably where the sand came from in the first place. It either got washed there or wind driven.
So compatibility is less of an issue.
Exactly. And if you can put it on an adjacent beach, you don't have to pump it as far. You don't have to dewater it. You don't have to store it. You don't have to do it. You can pump it onto the beach, move it around with some heavy equipment, and groom it, plant it, and walk away. So that's always the first choice, and that's why the Matticat project, I think, would be a good one. Is the next time that the entrance channel into Hither Creek gets dredged. The last time that was dredged was, I think, 1989. The next time that gets dredged, the spoils from that project will be pumped up onto that barrier beach to protect Millie's Bridge and that area along Ames Street, because that was the approved disposal site when it was dredged in 1989. So a lot simpler to permit a project that's been approved and has a disposal site that's been used before. You just use that site again. You re-permit it and you use it again. So that's the ultimate thing to do in Matticat, is to pump that sand onto that beach.
If you look at an aerial map of that area, you can see that the bridge is not parallel to the shoreline.
No.
And what that means is that the bridge may be there for a while, but the road to get to the bridge may not be there. And
Very
then what
important.
do you do?
Very important. Thankfully, we own some property on that side of I guess it would be on the east side of Matticat, of Ames Street. We own some property along there to the creek. So if the road had to be relocated, we could move it. The problem with that is that we don't own the property on the other side.
No.
There's a private person who owns that property. But the good news is the road could be moved, reconnected to the bridge, if you will. The bridge gets inspected every 2 years by the Department of Transportation, Massachusetts Department of Transportation. And they dive on it, and they do structural analysis. And a few years ago, the DPW got a contract and did some major repairs. And I've not witnessed it, but the people who do witness this every year, or every 2 years, it's important to them, have said that the Mass DOT quote was, "The bridge is bomb-proof. The bridge is in really good shape." But to your point, if we had to relocate, we do have some room to relocate that road, to the east there. But
You can't do it indefinitely, but there's something there.
there is, and it's not a very big piece. It's narrow and long. It runs along that road, but there is something that if you did lose that intersection, which is my biggest concern, is protecting that corner.
We've barely scratched the surface on all these things. We could go on all day,
Well,
but can I get you to come back sometime?
I would love to.
That'd be great. Dave Fronzuto, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
For Coastal Matters, I'm Charlie Walters. Thanks for tuning in. Please tune in again next time.